Right, so hello, welcome to our Sunday Philosophy Club here in the deepest heart of France, Limousin, La Creuse. So what we've been doing is going through different world spiritual traditions and philosophical ideas. I think tonight's class is going to be slightly different because I've just had a meeting of the World Wisdom Forum, which is an international group that I'm chairing for intellectuals all over the world interested in helping solve the world's problems. So this class is going to be more about applied philosophy, right? And I hope it'll be of interest to a more general, viewing audience. So we're recording this just the day before Halloween. It's October 30th, which is the Druid New Year, actually. Samhain means the summer ends. So it's the sort of end of the year for the Druid community. And it's sort of, here in France it takes a long time to get cold, which is amazing. It's still pretty warm outside. But it is coming to the end of summer. And so it's a good time to take stock. Not just the Druids, but many people say that this time of year is a sacred time because the gods, the spirits of the departed come closer to this realm. And so it's a time for going within, looking at deeper reflection, contemplating the meaning of life. And that's what we're going to be doing tonight. And I'll sort of go for half the time, then we'll stop and have some questions and stuff, like normal, and then finish off with the second half. So just a few words about the World Wisdom Forum. So this meets every 30th of each month. I've been running these online meetings for the last 2 years during the pandemic with intellectuals from all over the world. Today we had people from America, from India, from Africa, from the UK, and other world regions and cultures. Ireland, somebody from, and Israel, in fact. So it was quite a wide range, from the Middle East. And we were discussing a particular problem. We take different problems each month, but we've set up a commission on global good governance, which is an issue that's interested me for many years. I'm going to be talking about it. Which thinkers have said we need some kind of world governance system. Because at the moment we have this national system of governance. Here in Europe we've surrendered some of that with the European Union. And obviously we have the UN, but it doesn't have much power or authority. So today we were hearing from a speaker who's a very learned philosopher actually, and academic and teacher from the UK. He was joining us from Essex. And he was giving us a talk based on his many years of writing research. He's called Nicholas Haggard. And I first came across his work when I discovered a book about his idea of the unity between all religions based on light. He's a believer that light is the primal substance that brought humanity to think philosophically. And as we saw when we looked at the Zoroastrian religion on the periodic table, they build these great temples of fire, and fire is the sacred element for them. Fire is sacred to the Druids. We build bonfires at Betete and also at Samhain. And that lives on in the November the 5th bonfire that they have in the UK. Fire is sacred in the Jewish religion. They burn their menorah for Sabbath and sacred festival times. And in Christianity, fire is sacred. They burn candles in the churches. There's normally one burning everywhere. So fire is a sacred thing. Now, Nicholas argued in a very important book a couple of decades ago that fire was the beginning of the human religious imagination, and that therefore why can't all religions of the world get on and just be at peace, if we all celebrate fire. And when I discovered that book on the Isle of Anglesey, actually, which is the Druid Holy Island in North Wales, where I'd set up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for Britain and Ireland, I thought, this guy's great, And then since then we become friends, and now he's on our World Wisdom Forum as the chair of the Global Good Governance Commission, or working group. So I just want to tap into this question of world governance. Why is it important? In my early 20s, when I was living in Canada, I was beginning my study of all world religions in depth using the University of Calgary. I used to go along on Sundays to the Quaker meetings in Calgary, which was a small group. We just sit together for an hour, a bit like I do in my daily meditations, but they go on for an hour. And I love the Quakers. They're gentle people. They care about the world, about peace and stuff. And after the meeting's over, the hour-long prayer thing's over, then there's like social networking. You chat, have a coffee, and they once a month they'd bring a lunch. People would bring sandwiches, salads, that kind of thing. You get to know each other. And one time, somebody gave me this leaflet called the World Federalist Association. And I read it, and I thought, well, this is just common sense. It's a Canadian group wanting a world federation. So every country would keep its sovereignty, do its thing. Chile would go on being Chile, France would go on being Vive la France. But they would pull certain common things, like there'd be a world army. They wouldn't keep their own. There'd be certain things would come under the World Federation. And really the model is that of the Canadian Federation, which I'm fortunately a citizen of. So we have a federal government based in Ottawa, and then we have provincial governments like Alberta, where I lived, or British Columbia, who deal with local issues. So the same thing could be done globally. Each nation state would be like a province, and then there'd be a world federal capital somewhere, which would deal with common issues, common problems. So this seemed to me, when I first encountered, a good idea. I went back to the UK in the 80s, and I joined the World Federal Association in the UK, and I was on their board. We used to meet in the House of Commons. It was the first time I'd really gone into Parliament, because we had several MPs that were supporting this project. There were from a variety of parties, mostly either Liberals or Labour MPs, and also Lords. And it was my first glimpse of how politics works. And later on I ran 30 meetings in Parliament, realising it's there as a body that's supposed to serve the people. It's not sort of us against them, it's actually us. And we should use Parliament for our meetings and organise events and stuff, working with intelligent politicians, which seem to be much more difficult to find these days. In my days, in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, there were some people of great integrity. I think there still are. And some of them had this vision of a world governance. And of course Britain, with its Commonwealth, used to be called the British Empire, there are 53 nations. We could put a lot of weight to the idea of a world governance system. And that's why I thought it was worth bothering with. And we were also a member of the European Union, which is another sort of mini oasis of sanity and common sense and applying reason to politics. Okay, so that's why I love the European Union, and it's only because of that I'm able to live in France here. And I want the UK to rejoin as soon as possible. Okay, so what is the model of world government that we were discussing? Well, it was, as I say, put forward by Nicholas Hagar in several of his books. And because he's a philosopher, it's worth looking at the antecedents. This idea has come from somewhere, Who else has wanted a world government in history, from the different spiritual and religious traditions, for example? One of the most important and influential thinkers was Alexander the Great, who was the student of Aristotle. And we had a whole class here in the philosophy class on Aristotelian philosophy, which I always enjoyed teaching. I'm a great fan of Aristotle. I think he's you know, he was a bit of a genius, really. And Alexander was his brightest and most incredible student, who was the son of the king of Macedonia, Philip of Macedon. And Aristotle's father was a medical doctor at the court of Philip of Macedon, you see. And from the family of descendants of Asclepius, the god of healing. So Aristotle grew up in that medical kind of think tank environment. He was supposed to be a doctor. But when he was young, his father changed his mind and sent him to Athens, which was the intellectual capital of Greece, to study in Plato's academy. And Aristotle studied there for, you know, many years, and did the equivalent of like many degrees. We would now call them like a PhD type level of study. And he got on really well with Plato, who admired his intelligence. And it's said that once Plato was teaching, he used to give lectures in the academy. He was giving this lecture once, and he noticed Aristotle wasn't in the audience. He said, "Oh dear, the mind of the academy is not with us," which is quite a compliment. But Aristotle began the study of political science, and he divided governance systems into either monarchies, aristocracies, or democracies. And he started studying constitutions because he had lots of students from all over the then known world. They would report back to him, "Oh, the constitution of our city is a mix of an aristocracy and a democracy, say," or "Ours is mostly a democracy, but we also have a king, although he doesn't do much, so it's got a bit of a monarchy." And it was based on these first-hand reports that Aristotle sort of put them all out on the papyrus scrolls and said, "I think we can sort this lot into three categories." Right. He also acknowledged that each of those three can deteriorate and become its own worst enemy. So a monarchy can deteriorate and become a tyranny, like when the king goes crazy and, you know, executes his enemies without law. A democracy can go crazy and become like a mob rule, like happened during the later days of the French Revolution, when they got the guillotine going and just killed everyone that they thought was an enemy of the revolution. And the aristocrats just got their heads chopped off just for being, you know, aristocrats. It wasn't their fault. So democracy can also deteriorate, and I would say that happened under Hitler's rule. Hitler was voted in democratically, but then he stopped all that and ruled under emergency legislation, but effectively empowered the mob, who he trained up as his armed troops, you know, his SS and SA and all that. So he ended up as a mobster, having used democracy to get power. And that's why people are afraid of Trump. He's sort of trying to do the same thing. In America, there are these right-wing Republicans who've been reading Hitler's playbook, are trying to seize democracy and misuse it to end democracy. They're trying to get people off the voting register they don't like, black minority types, the poor, the unemployed. They're disenfranchising them all from voting, because their vision of democracy is very elitist kind of thing, you know. And so there's a lot of... if Aristotle was alive now, he'd be looking at American politics with great interest. The same things happen in Russia, where Putin has kind of become a tyrant. He's although there isn't technically a monarchy, he's usurping that role, and he's silencing all opposition. I mean, literally, if you give a public lecture like this in Russia, I get 15 years of imprisonment if I'm against the war in Ukraine, just as an intellectual, you know. So people don't dare speak out, and they're leaving Russia in thousands, having to fight a war that Putin has dreamed up in his own twisted, paranoid mind. Now that's a tyrant. Aristotle would absolutely say that guy's become a tyrant now, you know. The other form of governance, Aristotle said, is aristocracy. Now, that doesn't mean the old families rule. That's a deterioration of aristocracy. What it really meant was the best should rule. So the best doctors would give advice on medicine, the best economists would give advice on economics, the best poets would advise on the Delphic Games. The best people at inventing stuff would run the technology department, and the best musicians would advise on the National Orchestra of France or whatever. That was the idea. Aristocracy, has done tremendous things for humanity, and I'm not anti-aristocratic, because if you think about it, most of the colleges of the University of Paris and the University of Oxford, the University of Cambridge and Bologna, they were founded by aristocrats who sponsored creating colleges like Peterhouse College in Cambridge, where my daughter's doing a PhD. It was funded by these aristocrats who had the wealth, and then they donated it to education. And if you think about some of the greatest philosophers in history, they were either sponsored by or patronised by aristocrats. Plato himself was from an aristocratic background, which is why he had such a good education. Now, like Aristotle, I'm not against aristocracy when it works. What I'm against is when it becomes corrupt, when you can buy your way into the aristocracy without having the merit, when you can just pretend, and that's what the shamble of Boris Johnson's corrupt state. When aristocracy becomes a plutocracy, it becomes a money can buy into this prestige. So what's happened in the UK, the aristocratic system has sort of broken down, because now if you're a rich, billionaire from Russia or wherever, Saudi Arabia, just buy your way into the British leading aristocratic establishment. And some of these billionaires have set up colleges, named after various dubious potentates around the world, to buy influence and prestige. But they lack the merit and the intelligence to actually wield that degree of power. And it's been a shameful spectacle to see Boris Johnson appointing some of the Russian former KGB people who engineered Brexit, as we now know, with the support of Putin's military intelligence, actually putting them into the House of Lords, as if they're worthy of that. I did 30 meetings in the House of Lords. I've met genuine aristocrats, and you can't buy your way into goodness or true nobility of character. So anyway, long story. The deterioration of aristocracy ends up as plutocracy, said Aristotle, and he was sadly being proved right. Anyway, cut a long story short, his brightest student was Alexander the Great, who, I'm not a military person myself, but Alexander had this vision: if only he could conquer Persia and unite the world through military conquest, he could then create a sort of world federation, a world government. It's not a route that I think one ought to go down, but Alexander probably went down it more effectively than anyone else before or since. He was a brilliant military general who defeated, with not a huge army from Macedon, the might of the Persian Empire, which had attacked Greece several times. So they saw it as a sort of recompense. We're going to fight you back, kind of thing. And then he also conquered Egypt, although it was a bloodless thing. They actually welcomed him in, and they more or less said he was a god, because he went to the Siwa oasis and did an oracle there, which said, "You're the son of God," to Alexander the Great, which is where that idea of being a son of God first fixed in the Hellenistic mind, that later Jesus was said, oh, well, he's the son of God too. I've written a rather witty paper about sons of God. There's quite a few of them in the ancient world. It's not there shouldn't be a shortage of this. It was an esteem that was given to somebody if they did magnificent deeds. And the oracle said, well, Alexander deserves it. Interesting enough, he then went off to Asia and conquered what was now Afghanistan. He went into northern India, and wherever he went, he was always trying to be friendly with the people. If you surrendered your city to him, that was fine. You just had a banquet. He appointed someone to help run the place, and then he went on. If you resisted him and threw arrows and spears from your city walls, then he would besiege you and conquer it. But he wasn't fanatically ruthless or anything. He wasn't stupid. And in fact, at a certain point, he went so far as to marry Roxanne, who was of Persian origin, but from up in what is now Turkmenistan, sort of Central Asia. Fell in love with her, and it was a symbolic marriage to say, let Europe and Asia fall in love with each other. Because they'd been fighting for centuries, millennia. He wanted Europe and Asia to make peace. And he thought if he married an Asian woman, that would be a symbol of that. And he encouraged his Greek generals and officers to marry Persian women, which was the enemy. It's like Hitler saying to the SS, you've got to marry a Jewess, which would have been unthinkable because they were racist. Alexander wasn't a racist, and his last speech, which was given at a place called Opis in Iraq, was recorded by some people that listened to it. That's where he talks about world governments. He says, look, I've united the whole world through my military exploits. Now I want us all to live in peace. I want us not to fight wars against each other. If anyone has a complaint, bring it to me. I'm the emperor. I'll deal with it. I want each nation in the world to follow its religion, its customs, its culture, in peace. And whether you're Egyptian or Persian or Greek or whatever, let's live in truth and justice and do honour to the gods. Anyway, that was his vision, which I think is, in a sense, it was one of the very first attempts at a world governance system. It failed because he died very shortly afterwards. He had got internal politics going on in his court, his inner sanctum, I don't know, there's a rumour that he was poisoned. That's also possible, because, and this is a problem that comes up, when you try and do good in the world, you often get opposed and people try and bring you down. Another attempt was the Persian Empire, which, again, I think began as quite a noble idea. Darius, who sort of founded the Persian Empire, I think had the same vision. Let's have one united world under Ahura Mazda, the god of truth, justice and righteousness, and we can all live in peace. The trouble with this is that if you didn't want that, then he would oppose you and come and mercilessly, hound you and kill you, which is why he invaded Greece under his successor Xerxes. And the Persian Empire didn't, therefore, last, and it was finally defeated by Alexander the Great, although it did revive and became the Parthian Empire, which was still Zoroastrian, around about the time of Christ, and then later it became the Sassanid Empire. But it was still the same Persian Empire. But it was finally conquered by the Muslims, who then made Islam pretty much obligatory in Persia. It's interesting that as we speak, Persia's up in turmoil because the women of Persia are protesting at the stupidity of some of the Islamic laws. Like they have to wear a particular dress and veils and so on, and they're saying, no, we're just human beings, we're entitled to walk around with whatever we want to wear on our heads, like normal people. And I'm praying, holding my breath, that it's not going to end in a terrible bloodbath, because the young people of Iran are really putting their lives on the line here, the women especially. These are teenagers and young university student ages. They've had enough with the strictness of certain, I think, misinterpretations of Islam. I don't believe true Islam is about that. Let's look at Islam. That's another attempt at world governance. I think Muhammad, who was a visionary prophet, a seer, will be looking at Islam in much more detail in a couple of weeks' time. He felt that he was receiving downloads, insight, revelations that were universally applicable, valid for all tribes, all peoples and all times. Now the thing is, Muhammad was not a learned man in the sense of he had no higher education. He'd never been to any of the academic centres that were around at that time. He knew very little about geography. I mean, for instance, he didn't know the Earth was a round ball. He'd never heard of the Americas. He'd never heard of the Celtic world. He didn't know about Druids. The Quran, which I've done a big commentary on, took me 10 years, is brilliant, a magnificent text. I love it to bits. But it's not a very good source if you're going to base your entire higher education system and your entire political and government system on it. You have to be quite careful if you're going to do that, because it's what God's messages look like through the mind of a 7th century illiterate, because it said he was illiterate, desert educated merchant, which is what Muhammad was, who was highly intelligent. He'd met people who'd influenced him, but there's a lot of things missing from the Quran. Like, for example, it sounds like a quibble, but he absolutely had never heard of Aristotle. He'd never heard of Greek philosophy or Plato. He didn't know about the academy. He was sort of trying to reinvent the wheel, not realising that the wheel was actually already invented, which was a superhuman effort, because what he was dealing with was a very, kind of Wild West type situation in Arabia, which did things like female infanticide, and he was definitely an improvement on some of what had gone before, but in terms of a model for global governance, it left a bit of chaos. And so what we had is, although Islam spread, and did spread out over the whole Middle East, as far as India, Central Asia, all of the Arabian Peninsula, into North Africa, at one point into Spain, it became a global religion. Different factions in Islam were always fighting each other as to which was the best form of governance, and finally who should have authority. Because governance is largely about who's in power, who's got authority. And Islam has never resolved this problem right up to the present day. I could proclaim myself the caliph of all the world. Technically, I could argue in Islamic law that, that wouldn't go down very well with quite a lot of people. And, the Ottoman Sultan declared himself the caliph of all the world up until when it was abolished in the 1920s. And again, it was accepted in some quarters, but the Persians never accepted the Ottoman Caliphate, because the Ottomans were Sunni, which was a particular branch of Islam that followed the teachings of Muhammad's last wife, Aisha, and the customs that she claimed he introduced, and that, on behalf of her father, who was one of the immediate successors of Muhammad, and they ignored really the role of Ali, who was the son-in-law of Muhammad, married to his daughter. Whereas the Shias in Iran were all following Ali's teachings. So, ever since actually just after Muhammad's death, Islam has been split into these two factions. So, in terms of model of world governance, they've been fighting each other as to which model should there be. And we see this in the conflict between the Wahhabi dynasty in Saudi Arabia, that follow a very strict Sunni reading, and the Shias of Iran, of which there are many, many blends and shades. The current ruling elite of Iranian theocracy follow a particular branch. I've attended many seminars at the Harvard University Center for Shia Studies, and I've just read a new biography that's come out about Ali, who I have a lot of respect for. I think the true Shia religion has never been actually properly understood. I don't think the true Sunni one has either. And I set up some years ago an attempt to reconcile the two divisions of Islam. But like that tragic cooperation between the two wings is causing state meltdown in Yemen, where the two wings are fighting, and also in Lebanon, where the two wings are fighting, and Lebanon and Yemen are just becoming ungovernable. I would say that true Islam is totally compatible with all the other faiths in a peaceful and law-abiding way. I've been round the wonderful museum in Hyderabad, which in southern India was left by the last ruler of Hyderabad, who was a Muslim in southern India, and a friend of Queen Victoria, marvellous lineage of Muslim rulers in Hyderabad that give an example of what Islam should have been at its best, I think. And they had a wonderful collection of Qurans on display, including mini Qurans this big, and they're all handwritten in Arabic. Alexander the Great didn't work, the Persian Empire didn't work, Islam didn't really work, except insofar as it does teach a way of inner moral self-governance. The Islamic way to world governance is like control yourself, your nafs, your ego, surrender your spirit to the absolute, Allah, and then if we all do that, then we all live in peace and amity. Then the Mongol Empire tried and said, well, we'll take over history, we'll set up the great world empire. Genghis Khan conquered everywhere from China to Russia to France. His armies even got into France and Persia. And it was the largest empire ever seen up to that point. It was like a world government. But it was ruled by blood and violence and war and death. And wherever their armies left, they left mountains of skulls, That's not the kind of world governance we want in the World Wisdom Forum. I've nothing personally against the Mongolian people. They were later turned into Tantric Buddhists by Tibetan missionaries that went and taught them. And they in turn nominated one of the top Buddhists to become the Dalai Lama. That was a Mongolian gift. The Mongolians are wonderful people, but their attempt at world state building was going down the wrong path of military conquest. And then we see the same happen with the Chinese. Now, the Chinese world governance idea was never really that big. It was like, let's just civilize and keep China, using its Taoist and Confucian ideas. It didn't really want to look outside the other side of the wall. And that's still to some extent the Chinese view. But there is a more cosmopolitan approach in China. Some of the great modern Chinese philosophers have said they need to be aware that everyone is a citizen of their village, a citizen of their county, a citizen of their nation, a citizen of their region, a citizen of the entire world, and then a citizen of the entire cosmos. We coexist like Russian dolls at all levels of identity. And one of the greatest contemporary Chinese philosophers, articulated that. And each level of identity brings a certain set of duties and rights. So I have certain duties to my village, to my region, and so on. That's a good sort of way to think about Chinese philosophy and its contribution to world governance. But I think Confucius and the Taoist system emphasize the inner governance. If you follow the Tao, you don't need governing because you're doing what's naturally right. We all have within us this sense of right and wrong, said Mencius, this inner sense of the Tao. And when we do something right, like a tuning fork, it rings right. We do something wrong, it's all wonky, it's like a piano that can't play. And so that was the philosophical contribution by the Chinese to this idea of world governance. I want to mention the Dutch because they also created this extraordinary empire, as did the Spanish and the Portuguese from Europe. And they all set out with their sort of world governance schemes. I mean, Spain was the greatest power in Europe for over 100 years, with after the reign of Emperor Charles V, extended vastly, but all the way to South America and then on to the Philippines. And I've been to the museum in Manila in the Philippines where they